The sound of 145 pairs of boots snapping to attention echoed across the parade ground at Fort Davidson. But what happened next would shatter more than military protocol. It would expose a predator who had hidden behind his rank for years, and prove that sometimes justice comes not from the system, but from the courage of one woman who refused to be silenced. Staff Sergeant Bonnie Evans stood at attention with the rest of her unit, unaware that in less than 10 minutes she would deliver a lesson in self-defense that would end a career, spark an investigation, and change the lives of dozens of women who had suffered in silence. This is the story of how one moment of courage can bring down years of institutional abuse. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Georgia heat pressed down on Fort Davidson like a suffocating blanket, but Staff Sergeant Bonnie Evans barely noticed as she jogged the perimeter of the base at 0530. At 27, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had earned respect through competence rather than politics. Her dark hair was pulled back in the regulation bun, and her PT uniform showed the results of 6 years of disciplined military life, lean muscle, and an economy of movement that spoke to both strength and precision. Fort Davidson was home to the 3rd Infantry Division's Training Command, a sprawling complex of barracks, training facilities, and administrative buildings nestled in the pine forests of central Georgia. For most of the 8,000 personnel stationed there, it was a stepping stone, a place to hone skills before deployment, or to decompress after returning from overseas assignments. But for some, like Bonnie, it had become something more permanent. Her expertise in combat logistics and her ability to train new recruits had made her invaluable to the command structure. What she didn't know was that her competence had also made her a target. Captain Marcus Dane emerged from the base gymnasium. As Bonnie completed her circuit, his predatory gaze tracking her movement across the parade ground. At 34, Dane was everything the Army loved to promote. Tall, conventionally handsome, from a military family with connections that reached back 3 generations. His father had been a colonel, his grandfather a general, and Marcus had grown up believing that rank came with privileges that extended far beyond the official handbook. "Evans," he called out, his voice carrying the particular tone of authority that expected immediate compliance. "Hold up." Bonnie slowed to a stop, maintaining the proper distance and posture required when addressing a superior officer. She'd learned early in her career that the best way to deal with difficult officers was through flawless adherence to protocol. It left no room for criticism or retaliation. "Sir," she acknowledged, her breathing steady despite the 5-mile run she'd just completed. Dane approached with the casual confidence of someone who had never been told no by anyone who mattered. His eyes lingered on her figure in a way that made her skin crawl, but she kept her expression neutral. She'd dealt with worse in her 6 years of service, and she'd learned that showing discomfort only encouraged certain types of men. "I've been reviewing the training schedules for next month's new recruits," Dane said, stepping closer than regulation required. "I think we need to discuss some adjustments to your curriculum. Why don't you come by my office this evening around 1900? We can go over the details." There it was, the request that wasn't really a request. Bonnie had heard stories about Captain Dane's evening meetings from other female soldiers, whispered conversations in the mess hall and barracks that painted a picture of a man who used his authority to corner women in situations they couldn't escape from without damaging their careers. "Sir, if it's about training schedules, perhaps we could review them during normal duty hours?" she suggested, keeping her voice respectful but firm. "I could stop by your office this afternoon before 1700. Dane's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered in his eyes. He was a man accustomed to getting his way, and any resistance, no matter how politely phrased, was seen as a challenge to be overcome rather than a boundary to be respected. I'm afraid my afternoon is completely booked, he lied smoothly. 1900 hours will work much better. And Evans? This isn't really a request. The training command needs these schedules finalized, and as your commanding officer, I'm giving you a direct order to attend this meeting. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Disobey and face the consequences of insubordination. Attend and face whatever Dane had planned for their private meeting. It was the same impossible choice that had silenced dozens of women before her, but Bonnie Evans was not like the others who had come before. Understood, sir. I'll be there at 1900 hours. Her voice remained steady, professional, giving no indication of the storm brewing beneath the surface. As Dane walked away, clearly satisfied with his successful manipulation, Bonnie stood motionless for several minutes, her mind racing through possibilities. She'd known this moment would come eventually. Dane's reputation preceded him, and she'd been careful to avoid being alone with him since arriving at Fort Davidson 8 months ago. But now he was using direct orders to create the situation he wanted. That afternoon, Bonnie made several crucial decisions that would change everything. First, she visited the base legal office and reviewed the regulations regarding recording conversations with superior officers. The rules were complex, but there were provisions for documenting meetings when misconduct was suspected. Second, she stopped by the base exchange and purchased a small digital recorder, the kind students used for lectures. Finally, she called her younger sister Rachel, a criminal justice major at the University of Georgia, and had a very specific conversation about self-defense laws and the right to protect oneself from assault. "Bonnie," Rachel had said, her voice tight with concern over the phone, "promise me you'll be careful. If this guy is what you think he is, he's dangerous. Men like that don't stop until someone makes them stop." "I know," Bonnie replied quietly. "And I think it's time someone did." As evening approached, Bonnie prepared for the meeting with the methodical precision she brought to all aspects of military life. She reviewed the base regulations on assault and harassment, familiarized herself with the emergency procedures for reporting incidents, and mentally rehearsed the self-defense techniques she'd learned during her combat training. Most importantly, she placed the digital recorder in her breast pocket, positioned to capture audio clearly. At 1855 hours, she stood outside Captain Dane's office in the administrative building, a structure that was largely empty after duty hours. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of evening formation calls from the barracks areas. She knocked twice, sharp and professional. "Enter," came Dane's voice from within. Bonnie opened the door and stepped inside, immediately noting several details that confirmed her worst suspicions. The office blinds were drawn, unusual for an evening meeting about training schedules. Dane had removed his uniform jacket and loosened his tie, creating an atmosphere of false intimacy. Most tellingly, there were no training documents visible on his desk, just a bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses. "Staff Sergeant Evans reporting as ordered, sir," she announced, maintaining proper military bearing despite the obvious setup. "Close the door behind you," Dane commanded, his earlier professional demeanor already beginning to slip. "And relax. A little, Bonnie. We're just going to have a friendly conversation about your career." The use of her first name was another red flag. In 6 years of military service, she'd learned to recognize the patterns that preceded inappropriate behavior: the isolation, the creation of false intimacy, the gradual breakdown of professional boundaries. Bonnie closed the door but remained at attention near the entrance. "Sir, I'm ready to review the training schedules whenever you are." Dane's laugh was low and predatory. "You know, Evans, I've been watching you for months. You're different from the other female soldiers on this base. Stronger, more capable. I think you and I could have a very beneficial working relationship." He stood up from behind his desk and moved toward her, his intentions becoming clearer with each step. Of course, such relationships require mutual understanding, cooperation, flexibility. Sir, I believe we should focus on the training materials, Bonnie replied firmly, her hand moving subtly toward the recorder in her pocket to ensure it was capturing everything. Oh, we will, Dane said, now standing close enough that she could smell the whiskey on his breath. But first, I think we need to establish some ground rules about how things work in my command. Without warning, his hand shot out toward her waist, intending to pull her closer. It was the moment Bonnie had been preparing for, mentally and physically, since receiving his order that morning. What happened next would be burned into the memory of everyone who witnessed it, a split-second demonstration that predators often discover too late that they've chosen the wrong victim. But that confrontation was still hours away. First, Bonnie had to survive the next few minutes in Captain Dane's office, where a man drunk on power and whiskey was about to learn that not every woman could be intimidated into submission. The stage was set, the players in position, and the reckoning that had been building for months was about to begin. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot too. U.S. Now back to the story. The moment Captain Dane's hand reached for her waist, Bonnie's combat training kicked in with lightning precision. She caught his wrist in a grip that made him gasp, her fingers finding the pressure points she'd learned during close-quarters combat instruction. The surprise in his eyes was almost comical. He'd expected submission, not resistance. Sir, I suggest you remove your hand, Bonnie said, her voice deadly calm despite the adrenaline flooding her system. The digital recorder in her pocket was capturing every word, every sound of their encounter. Dane's face flushed red with a mixture of embarrassment and rage. No enlisted soldier, especially not a woman, had ever dared to physically resist him. His other hand moved toward her shoulder, attempting to assert dominance through intimidation. You little, he began, but Bonnie cut him off by applying slightly more pressure to his wrist. The pain made him freeze mid-sentence. Captain Dane, she said, her grip unwavering, you have approximately 3 seconds to step back and return to professional conduct, or this situation is going to escalate in ways you won't appreciate. For a moment, they stood frozen in a tableau of power dynamics reversed. The predator had become the prey, and both of them understood it. But Marcus Dane had never learned to accept defeat gracefully. His family's military legacy, his connections, his years of getting away with similar behavior, all of it convinced him that a mere staff sergeant couldn't possibly challenge his authority. He made the fatal mistake of trying to grab her with his free hand. Bonnie's response was swift and devastating. She released his wrist, ducked under his reaching arm, and delivered a precise strike to his solar plexus that doubled him over. As he gasped for breath, she stepped back to the door, her hand on the handle. This meeting is concluded, sir, she announced formally. I'll be filing a report about this incident through proper channels. Dane straightened slowly, his face contorted with fury and humiliation. You have no idea what just done, Evans. No idea who you're dealing with. My family has connections that reach all the way to the Pentagon. I can destroy your career with a single phone call. Then I suppose we'll see whose version of events the investigation believes, Bonnie replied, patting her breast pocket where the recorder sat. Have a good evening, sir. She left Dane standing in his office, clutching his bruised ribs and finally understanding that he'd encountered someone who wouldn't be intimidated. But as she walked through the empty corridors of the administrative building, Bonnie knew the real fight was just beginning. Men like Dane didn't simply accept defeat, they escalated. Her prediction proved accurate within hours. The next morning, Bonnie arrived for morning formation to find First Sergeant Patricia Hawkins waiting for her with a grim expression. Hawkins was a 20-year veteran who'd clawed her way up through the ranks in an era when female senior NCOs were even rarer than they were now. She'd seen every form of retaliation the military could devise, and her face told Bonnie everything she needed to know. "Evans, you need to report to Colonel Richardson's office at 0800, Hawkins said quietly. "And Bonnie? Whatever happened last night, you'd better have your facts straight. Captain Dane has already filed a formal complaint claiming you assaulted a superior officer." The accusation was as predictable as it was infuriating. Flip the script, make the victim the aggressor, and use the chain of command to silence any opposition. It was the same playbook predators had been using for decades, refined to perfection within military culture, where questioning authority was tantamount to treason. Colonel James Richardson commanded the training division with the weary efficiency of someone who'd spent 30 years watching good soldiers destroyed by politics and bad ones protected by connections. At 55, he'd served in Iraq, Afghanistan, and half a dozen smaller conflicts that never made the evening news. He understood the difference between combat effectiveness and bureaucratic maneuvering, but he also understood which one determined career advancement. Bonnie stood at attention in Richardson's office, flanked by Captain Dane and Major Lisa Santos, the base legal officer. The colonel's expression was carefully neutral, but she could see the calculation in his eyes. He was weighing the political cost of supporting a staff sergeant against a captain whose father happened to be a close friend of the base commanding. "General, Staff Sergeant Evans," Richardson began, his voice formal and distant. "Captain Dane has filed a serious allegation against you. He claims that during a routine meeting yesterday evening, you physically assaulted him without provocation. That's a court-martial offense that could end your career and land you in military prison." Dane sat smugly in his chair, confident that his version of events would prevail. He'd played this game before with other women, and the system had always protected him. Rank had its privileges, and one of those privileges was credibility. "Sir," Bonnie replied calmly, "I respectfully dispute Captain Dane's characterization of events. I was defending myself against unwanted sexual advances during what he claimed was a meeting about training schedules." "That's a serious counter-allegation, Sergeant," Major Santos interjected. "Do you have any evidence to support your claim?" Bonnie reached into her breast pocket and placed the digital recorder on Richardson's desk. "I recorded the entire encounter." "Ma'am, the evidence speaks for itself." The silence that followed was deafening. Dane's face went white as he realized his carefully constructed lie was about to be exposed. Richardson leaned forward, staring at the small device as if it were a live grenade. "You recorded a meeting with a superior officer without permission?" he asked slowly. "Sir, under Article 31 of the UCMJ and Base Regulation 27-3, personnel have the right to document interactions when they reasonably suspect misconduct," Bonnie replied. "I suspected Captain Dane's intentions were not professional, and the recording confirms my suspicions." Major Santos picked up the recorder with the careful precision of someone handling evidence in a capital case. "Colonel, we'll need to authenticate this recording and review its contents before proceeding with any charges." "Now wait just a minute," Dane interjected, his composure finally cracking. "This is clearly a setup. She obviously planned this whole thing to entrap me. You can't seriously consider the word of an enlisted soldier over that of a commissioned officer." The desperation in his voice was unmistakable. For the first time in his career, Marcus Dane was facing consequences for his actions, and he was discovering that his father's connections couldn't erase digital evidence. Richardson stood slowly, his 30 years of military experience evident in the weight of his decision. "Captain Dane, you're relieved of duty pending investigation." "Major Santos, I want that recording analyzed immediately." "Staff Sergeant Evans, you're restricted to base until we sort this out." As they filed out of the office, Dane brushed past Bonnie with a whispered threat. "This isn't over. You have no idea how deep my family's influence goes. Even if this recording is real, I'll make sure you never serve another day in the Army." But Bonnie was no longer afraid of his threats. She'd crossed the Rubicon the moment she'd fought back in his office, and there was no retreat now. The system would either protect her or destroy her, but she'd go down fighting. What she didn't know was that her confrontation with Dane had already been noticed by people far more dangerous than an entitled captain. Word of a female soldier recording and resisting a sexual assault had reached ears that viewed such defiance as a threat to the natural order of military hierarchy. The real war was about to begin, and Bonnie Evans had just painted a target on her back that extended far beyond Fort Davidson. But she'd also done something else. She'd provided other women with proof that predators could be stopped, that the system could be forced to listen, and that sometimes justice required someone willing to throw the first punch. Asterisk, the recording would be analyzed, the investigation would proceed, and Captain Marcus Dane would soon discover that his family's legacy couldn't protect him from the truth. But first, those who benefited from the current system would make one last desperate attempt to silence the woman who dared to fight back. They would discover, much to their regret, that Staff Sergeant Bonnie Evans was just getting started. Audio analysis took 3 days, but for Bonnie, each hour felt like a lifetime. Restricted to base meant she couldn't escape the whispers that followed her everywhere she went. Some soldiers looked at her with newfound respect. Word had spread quickly that someone had finally stood up to Captain Dane. Others viewed her with suspicion, seeing her as a troublemaker who'd violated the unspoken code of military hierarchy. Private Jessica Chun, a 19-year-old supply clerk, approached Bonnie outside the mess hall on the second day. Her hands shook as she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sergeant Evans, I heard what you did. What Captain Dane tried to do to you." Jessica glanced around nervously, ensuring no one could overhear. "He did the same thing to me 6 months ago, but I didn't fight back. I was too scared, too new. I didn't think anyone would believe me." Bonnie felt her stomach clench with a familiar mixture of rage and protective instinct. "Jessica, are you saying he assaulted you?" "Not exactly," Jessica replied, tears forming in her eyes. "But he cornered me in the supply warehouse after hours. Made it clear that my evaluations, my assignments, everything depended on being cooperative. I transferred to a different unit the next week, but I never reported it. I thought it was just how things worked." The confession hit Bonnie like a physical blow. How many others had suffered in silence? How many young soldiers had Dane intimidated into submission while the system looked the other way? Jessica's story confirmed what Bonnie had suspected. She wasn't Dane's first victim, just his first who'd fought back. "Jessica, would you be willing to make an official statement? What happened to you matters, and it could help prevent this from happening to others." The young private's face went pale. "I don't know, Sergeant. What if they don't believe me?" "What? If it makes things worse? My family is so proud that I'm serving, if this comes out." Bonnie understood the fear. Military culture demanded loyalty, obedience, and silence about problems that might embarrass the institution. Speaking out required a level of courage that most 19-year-olds hadn't developed yet. "Think about it," Bonnie said gently. "But remember, staying silent protects him, not you." That evening, Major Santos summoned Bonnie to the legal office with news that would change everything. The audio analysis had been completed, and the results were damning for Captain Dane. "The recording is authentic," Santos explained, her professional demeanor unable to hide her disgust at what she'd heard. "Our technical analysis confirms no tampering or editing. More importantly, the content clearly documents attempted sexual assault and abuse of authority." Bonnie felt a surge of vindication. But Santos's expression warned her that victory wouldn't come easily. "However," the major continued, "Captain Dane's family has retained civilian counsel. High-powered attorneys from Atlanta who specialize in military defense cases. They're already claiming the recording was illegal, that you entrapped their client." and that this is all part of a broader campaign to undermine male leadership in the military. The strategy was predictable but effective. When the facts weren't on your side, attack the process. Make the victim the aggressor, the evidence inadmissible, and the investigation a witch hunt. It was legal warfare designed to exhaust and discredit accusers until they gave up. "What's our next step, ma'am?" Bonnie asked. "Colonel Richardson wants to convene an Article 32 hearing, essentially a military grand jury to determine if there's enough evidence to proceed with a court-martial." "But Bonnie," Santos leaned forward, her voice dropping to a confidential tone, "you need to understand what you're up against. Dane's father, Brigadier General Robert Dane, has already contacted the base commanding general. Political pressure is mounting to resolve this quietly." The implication was clear. Take a transfer, accept a reprimand for inappropriate conduct, and let the whole thing disappear into the bureaucratic maze where uncomfortable truths went to die. "Major, what about justice? What about the other women?" "He's assaulted? What other women?" Santos asked sharply. "Do you have evidence of other incidents?" Bonnie thought about Jessica Chun's tearful confession, about the whispered stories she'd heard in the barracks. "I have testimony from at least one other victim, possibly more if they're willing to come forward." Santos's expression shifted from skeptical to interested. A pattern of abuse was much harder to dismiss than an isolated incident. Multiple victims meant the military's preferred solution, quietly transferring the problem, wouldn't work. "Can you get them to make official statements? I can try." The next morning brought an unexpected development that would prove crucial to everything that followed. Staff Sergeant Maria Gonzalez, a combat medic who'd recently returned from deployment in Syria, sought out Bonnie during PT formation. Maria was everything the Army wanted in a soldier. Tough, competent, decorated for valor under fire. She was also someone whose word carried weight throughout the base. When she spoke, people listened. "Evans," Maria said, matching Bonnie's pace as they ran the morning circuit, "we need to talk, privately." After formation, they met in an empty classroom in the education center. Maria's expression was grim as she closed the door behind them. "I heard about your situation with Dane," she began without preamble. "And I want you to know you're not alone. That bastard tried the same thing with me 2 years ago, before my deployment." Bonnie felt a mixture of relief and horror. Relief that another credible witness was coming forward. Horror at the scope of Dane's predatory behavior. "What happened?" "Similar setup to yours. Mandatory evening meeting, office with the blinds drawn, inappropriate suggestions about my career. Prospects. The difference was, I had orders for Syria the next week, so I could avoid him until I deployed. When I got back, he'd moved on to easier targets." Maria's jaw tightened with suppressed anger. "I've been kicking myself for 2 years for not reporting it. How many women could I have protected if I'd had your courage?" "It's not about courage," Bonnie replied. "It's about having the right circumstances. You had a deployment to worry about. I had the luxury of being able to fight. Well, I'm fighting now. I'll testify, make an official statement, whatever you need. It's time that Predator faced consequences." Word of Maria's support spread quickly through the informal networks that connected female soldiers across the base. By the end of the week, 3 more women had approached Bonnie with their own stories of harassment and assault by Captain Dane. Each story followed the same pattern: isolated meetings, threats disguised as career advice, and a system that punished victims more than perpetrators. The pattern was becoming undeniable. But so was the backlash. Anonymous notes appeared in Bonnie's locker, calling her a man-hater and a career destroyer. Her personal vehicle was vandalized in the parking lot, tires slashed and obscenities painted on the windshield. During mess hall conversations, certain groups of soldiers fell silent when she approached, their hostility palpable. The psychological warfare was designed to isolate and intimidate her into dropping the charges. But instead of weakening her resolve, the attacks confirmed that she was threatening something much larger than one predatory captain. She was challenging a culture that protected abusers and silenced victims. Colonel Richardson called her into his office on Friday afternoon with news that would reshape the entire investigation. "Evans, I've received word from Division Headquarters. The commanding general has decided to expand this investigation beyond Captain Dane. Apparently, your case has prompted several other women at different bases to come forward with similar allegations against other officers." Bonnie felt a chill run down her spine. "Sir, are you saying this is bigger than just Fort Davidson? Much bigger. The Criminal Investigation Division is taking over the case. You're no longer dealing with a local investigation. This has become a multi-base inquiry into what they're calling a pattern of systemic abuse." Asterisk, the weight of responsibility settled on Bonnie's shoulders like a physical burden. She'd wanted justice for herself and the women at Fort Davidson. Instead, she'd uncovered what appeared to be a network of predators protected by rank, connections, and institutional silence. What does this mean for the Article 32 hearing? It's been postponed pending the Seed investigation. You'll be transferred to a special victims unit at Fort Liberty for your protection while they build their case. Richardson stood and walked to his window, staring out at the parade ground where soldiers went through their daily routines, unaware that their world was about to change dramatically. "Evans, I want you to understand something. What you've started here isn't just about Captain Dane anymore. You've pulled a thread that's unraveling decades of covered-up abuse. There are people, powerful people, who will do everything in their power to stop this investigation. Sir, are you telling me to back down?" The colonel turned back to face her, and for the first time since she'd met him, his professional mask slipped. "I'm telling you to be careful. And I'm telling you that what you did in that office fighting back, recording the evidence, refusing to be silenced, that took more courage than anything I've seen in 30 years of military service." As Bonnie left Richardson's office, she realized that her personal fight for justice had evolved into something much larger. She was no longer just seeking accountability for one predator. She was challenging an entire system that had enabled and protected sexual predators for generations. The real battle was just beginning. Fort Liberty's Special Victims Investigation Unit occupied a nondescript building on the edge of the sprawling North Carolina installation, deliberately isolated from the main base to protect witnesses and investigators from interference. When Bonnie arrived on a humid Monday morning in August, she was struck by the building's anonymity. No signs, no military markings, just a plain concrete structure that could have housed anything from supply storage to administrative offices. Chief Warrant Officer Sandra Martinez met her at the entrance, her weathered face bearing the kind of expression that came from years of investigating humanity's darkest impulses. At 42, Martinez had spent the last decade building cases against military personnel who'd used their authority to prey on subordinates. She'd seen every form of institutional protection, political interference, and victim intimidation the system could devise. "Staff Sergeant Evans," Martinez said, extending a firm handshake. "I've rigged your file, listened to your recording, and reviewed the preliminary statements from the other victims. What you've uncovered isn't just significant, it's explosive." They walked through corridors lined with secure offices, each one housing investigators working on cases that could destroy careers and expose decades of institutional failure. The atmosphere was professional but tense, like a police station in a high-crime area where everyone understood the stakes. Martinez led Bonnie into a conference room where 3 other people waited. Special Agent Timothy Brooks from the Army's Criminal Investigation Division was a thin, intense man whose civilian clothes couldn't hide his military bearing. Captain Lisa Park, a military prosecutor from the Judge Advocate General's office, had the sharp-eyed look of someone who'd spent years building cases against skilled defense attorneys. The third person, Dr. Rebecca Stone, was a civilian psychologist who specialized in institutional trauma and systemic abuse patterns. "Before we begin," Martinez said, taking her seat at the head of the table, "I need you to understand the scope of what we're dealing with. Your case against Captain Dane was just the beginning. Based on the information you provided and the subsequent investigation, we've identified at least 12 officers across 7 different bases who appear to be part of a network that has systematically targeted female soldiers for sexual assault and harassment." The number hit Bonnie like a physical blow. 12 officers, 7 bases. How many victims had suffered in silence while these predators operated with impunity? Special Agent Brooks activated a wall-mounted display that showed a complex network analysis. Red dots represented confirmed perpetrators, blue dots indicated victims who'd come forward, and yellow dots marked potential connections still under investigation. The web of connections was staggering. "What you're looking at," Brooks explained, "is 20 years of carefully documented abuse enabled by a culture of silence and institutional protection. These weren't random incidents, they were part of a coordinated effort to drive women out of certain military occupational specialties through intimidation, assault, and career destruction." Captain Park leaned forward, her expression grim. "The legal challenges are substantial. Many of these officers come from military families with significant political connections. They've retained the best defense attorneys money can buy, and they're already mounting a coordinated campaign to discredit the investigation." Dr. Stone spoke for the first time, her voice carrying the clinical precision of someone who'd studied predatory behavior for decades. "What makes this case unique is the institutional element. These weren't lone wolves acting independently. They were part of a system that actively facilitated their behavior. Transfers were coordinated to move them away from investigations. Victims were reassigned to prevent them from testifying. Evidence was systematically destroyed or suppressed." Bonnie absorbed the information with growing horror and determination. "What you're describing sounds like organized crime." "That's exactly what it is," Martinez confirmed. "Organized crime in uniform, protected by rank and enabled by a culture that values institutional reputation over justice. The question now is whether you're prepared to be the key witness in the prosecution that brings them all down." The weight of responsibility was overwhelming. Bonnie had started by defending herself against one predator. Now she was being asked to take on an entire network of corrupt officers and the system that protected them. What would that involve? Brooks clicked to a new slide showing a timeline that stretched over the next 18 months. Congressional hearings, multiple court-martial proceedings, and media attention that will make your life very public. These defendants have resources that most criminals don't: political connections, military influence, and virtually unlimited legal budgets. They'll attack your character, your motivations, and your credibility in ways you can't imagine. They'll also try to intimidate you," Park added. "Anonymous threats, surveillance, harassment of your family members. We can provide protection, but we can't shield you from everything." Dr. Stone's expression was compassionate but direct. "Bonnie, the psychological cost of being the primary witness in a case this large can be devastating. You'll be reliving traumatic experiences repeatedly, defending your actions in public forums, and watching defense attorneys try to destroy everything you've worked for. Many people wouldn't be strong enough to handle it." The room fell silent as Bonnie considered their warnings. Through the window, she could see soldiers going about their daily routines, young men and women who'd volunteered to serve their country. Many of them unaware that the system they'd sworn to defend had failed to protect some of its most vulnerable members. She thought about Jessica Chun's trembling voice as she described her encounter with Captain Dane, about Maria Gonzalez's anger at herself for not speaking up sooner, about all the women whose names she didn't know who'd suffered in silence while predators operated with impunity. "How many victims are we talking about total?" Martinez consulted her files. Based on current evidence and preliminary interviews, we've identified 43 women who were assaulted, harassed, or had their careers destroyed by this network. That's just the ones willing to come forward. We estimate the actual number could be 3 times higher. 43 confirmed victims, possibly more than 100 total. Women who'd volunteered to serve their country and been betrayed by the very institution they'd sworn to protect. The magnitude of the injustice was staggering, but so was the opportunity to finally hold the perpetrators accountable. "What happens if I say no?" Bonnie asked. Brooks's expression was carefully neutral. "The case against Captain Dane will proceed. Based on your original complaint, he'll likely receive a reprimand, early retirement, and loss of some benefits. The larger investigation will stall without a credible primary witness willing to testify about the systematic nature of the abuse. And the other 43 victims? They'll get no justice at all," Martinez said bluntly. "The network will survive, the perpetrators will retire quietly, and the system will continue protecting predators while silencing victims." The choice was clear, even if the path forward wasn't easy. Bonnie had joined the military to serve something larger than herself. Now she was being asked to serve in a way she'd never imagined, not by carrying a weapon into combat, but by carrying the truth into courtrooms where the enemy wore the same uniform she did. "There's something else you need to know," Park said, her voice carrying a note of urgency. "We've received intelligence that some of the officers under investigation are planning to claim that this entire investigation is part of a broader conspiracy to undermine military readiness. They're going to argue that prosecuting them sends a message that male officers can't effectively lead female soldiers. It was the ultimate perversion of logic, turn a case about sexual assault into a debate about military effectiveness, make the perpetrators into victims of political correctness, and frame justice as a threat to national security." Dr. Stone nodded. Grimly, "It's a sophisticated defense strategy that's worked in civilian cases involving powerful defendants. They'll try to make this about anything except what it actually is, a network of predators who used their authority to assault subordinates." Bonnie stood and walked to the window, looking out at the base where thousands of soldiers trained for missions that required absolute trust in their fellow service members. The irony was devastating. These women had been willing to trust their lives to fellow soldiers in combat zones, only to be betrayed by their own leaders in supposed safe spaces. When she turned back to face the investigators, her voice was steady and determined. "I'll do it. I'll testify, cooperate with the investigation, and face whatever they throw at me. But I want something in return." "What's that?" Martinez asked. "I want those 43 women to know that someone fought for them. I want their attackers to face real consequences, not just transfers and early retirements. And I want to make sure this never happens to another generation of female soldiers." Brooks smiled for the first time since she'd entered the room. "Staff Sergeant Evans, you just volunteered for the fight of your life. I hope you're ready for it." "I've been ready since the moment Captain Dane put his hands on me," Bonnie replied. "The difference is, now I'm not fighting alone." As the meeting concluded and the investigators began outlining the next phases of the case, Bonnie felt a mixture of fear and determination that reminded her of her first day in basic training. She was about to enter unknown territory, face enemies she couldn't see, and fight battles that would test every aspect of her character. But she was also about to strike a blow for justice that had been decades in the making, ensuring that the predators who'd hidden behind rank and institutional protection would finally face the consequences of their crimes. The retaliation began. Within 48 hours of Bonnie's decision to cooperate with the expanded investigation, it started subtly mysterious technical difficulties with her secure phone, her military email account suddenly requiring multiple password resets, and her access card being deactivated twice in 1 week for routine security updates. Each incident could be explained away as bureaucratic incompetence, But the pattern was unmistakable. Chief Martinez had warned her that sophisticated opponents would use institutional tools rather than crude intimidation tactics. They can't threaten you directly, she'd explained, but they can make your life miserable through administrative warfare, death by 1,000 paper cuts. The psychological pressure intensified when Bonnie received a call from her mother in Portland, Oregon. Margaret Evans was a retired school teacher who'd raised 3 children as a single parent after her husband died in a construction accident. She was tough, practical, and not easily rattled, which made the fear in her voice all the more disturbing. "Bonnie, honey, something strange happened today. A man came by the house asking questions about you. Said he was a military investigator working on your background check for a promotion. But when I asked for identification, he said he'd left it in his car and never came back." The description Margaret provided middle-aged, wearing a cheap suit. Claiming to be from personnel command matched none of the legitimate investigators working on the case. Someone was conducting unauthorized surveillance on her family, probing for weakness or leverage they could use against her. "Mom, listen to me carefully," Bonnie said, her voice steady despite the rage building in her chest. "Don't talk to anyone about me unless they provide official military identification and you verify their identity through the base operator. If anyone approaches you again, call this number immediately." She gave her mother Chief Martinez's direct line, knowing that threatening family members was a federal crime that would only strengthen their case. But the message was clear: cooperate with the investigation, and the people you love become targets. Dr. Stone had prepared her for this escalation during their psychological evaluation sessions. "Institutional predators don't just attack their victims," she'd explained. "They attack support systems. Family, friends, colleagues, anyone who might. Providing emotional or material assistance becomes a potential pressure point." The strategy was working. Bonnie found herself second-guessing every phone call home, every conversation with friends outside the military. The paranoia was exhausting, but it was also clarifying. Every dirty trick they used only confirmed how much damage the truth could do to their network. The first major breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Staff Sergeant Michael Torres, a military police investigator at Fort Carson, Colorado, contacted the Special Victims Unit with information that would crack the case wide open. Torres had been investigating what appeared to be a routine sexual assault case when he discovered financial records that didn't make sense. The accused officer, Major Kevin Walsh, had been making regular payments to a private investigation firm in Washington, the same firm that was now conducting background checks on victims' families. "The payments go back 3 years, Torres explained during a secure video conference with the investigation team. "Always the same amount, always on the same day of the month." But here's the interesting part: the firm's client list includes 12 other military officers, all of whom are under investigation for sexual assault or harassment. Special Agent Brooks leaned forward, his expression sharp with interest. "Are you saying they've been paying for opposition research on their victims?" "More than that. The firm's been conducting comprehensive background investigations on female soldiers before they were even assaulted. Employment history, family finances, personal relationships, psychological profiles, everything you'd need to identify vulnerable targets and potential weak points for intimidation." The revelation was staggering. This wasn't just a network of individual predators, it was a sophisticated criminal enterprise that used professional investigators to hunt and stalk potential victims. They'd been industrializing sexual assault, turning it into a systematic campaign with research, planning, and coordination. Captain Park's face was grim as she reviewed the financial documents Torres had uncovered. "This changes everything. We're not just looking at assault charges anymore, we're looking at conspiracy, racketeering, and potentially violations of the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act if they accessed military personnel databases illegally." Dr. Stone was studying the psychological profiles the firm had compiled on victims. They were specifically targeting women with certain characteristics: single mothers who couldn't afford to lose their military benefits, soldiers from lower income, families who depended on military pay, women with previous trauma histories who might be less likely to report additional victimization. The coldly clinical nature of the targeting was horrifying. These weren't crimes of opportunity or passion. They were calculated attacks on the most vulnerable members of the military community, selected specifically because they were unlikely to fight back effectively. Bonnie stared at the evidence spread across the conference table, feeling a mixture of vindication and revulsion. How many women are on their target lists? Torres consulted his files. The firm's database contains detailed profiles on over 200 female service members across multiple installations. Not all of them were assaulted, but they were all considered potential targets. 200 women reduced to database entries, their vulnerabilities cataloged and cross-referenced for the convenience of predators. The scope of the conspiracy was beyond anything Bonnie had imagined when she'd first fought back against Captain Dane. The investigation's momentum accelerated dramatically as more evidence emerged. Bank records revealed a complex financial network that had funded the private investigation firm, legal defense funds for accused officers, and even payments to military personnel who'd helped suppress earlier investigations. Master Sergeant Jennifer Kim, a career counselor at Fort Hood, came forward with documentation showing how certain female soldiers had been deliberately counseled out of the military after reporting assault allegations. The paperwork was always legal, always justified by regulations, but the pattern was unmistakable. Victims were being systematically eliminated from service, while their attackers remained protected. They had it down to a science, Kim explained. During her videotaped testimony, victim reports assault, gets transferred to a dead-end assignment, receives negative counseling for minor infractions, and eventually accepts a discharge rather than face a career-ending administrative action. Meanwhile, the accused officer gets a quiet transfer and a clean slate. The bureaucratic machinery of the military had been weaponized against its own members, turning regulations designed to maintain order into tools for silencing inconvenient victims. It was corruption on an institutional level that went far beyond individual criminal acts. As the evidence mounted, the political pressure intensified from the other direction. Congressional offices began receiving calls from defense contractors, military family organizations, and retired generals expressing concern about the investigation's impact on military readiness and morale. Senator Patricia Hawthorne, chair of the Senate Armed Services Committee, scheduled emergency hearings on what she called the crisis of confidence in military leadership. But instead of supporting the investigation, the hearings seemed designed to question whether prosecuting so many officers simultaneously might damage national security. "We must ask ourselves," Senator Hawthorne declared during the opening session, "whether this unprecedented prosecution effort serves justice, or whether it represents a dangerous overcorrection that could undermine the very institution we depend on for our nation's defense." The political theater was predictable but effective. By framing the investigation as a threat to military effectiveness rather than an effort to eliminate criminal behavior, opponents were shifting the debate away from evidence and toward fear. Bonnie watched the hearings from the secure conference room at Fort Liberty, feeling the weight of political pressure that was being applied to shut down the investigation. Phone calls were being made, favors were being called in, and careers were being threatened, all to protect a network of predators who'd turned sexual assault into a systematic enterprise. But the evidence was too strong and too well documented to be suppressed by political maneuvering. Financial records, electronic communications, victim testimony, and documented patterns of institutional cover-ups created a case that was legally unassailable. Regardless of political pressure, Chief Martinez addressed the investigation team. as they prepared for the next phase of prosecutions. They're going to try everything: political pressure, media manipulation, legal technicalities, and personal attacks on our witnesses. But we have something they don't: the truth, backed by evidence they can't explain away. She turned to Bonnie directly. "Staff Sergeant Evans, you started this by refusing to be a victim. Now you have the opportunity to ensure that 43 other women get justice, and that hundreds more are protected from becoming victims in the future." The weight of responsibility was enormous, but so was the opportunity. In fighting back against one predator, Bonnie had uncovered a conspiracy that threatened the integrity of the entire military institution. Now she had the chance to help tear it down completely. The real trials were about to begin, and with them, the final test of whether justice could prevail against institutional corruption, backed by unlimited resources and political connections. But for the first time since this began, Bonnie felt confident about the outcome. They had the evidence, they had the law on their side. And most importantly, they had the truth. The first court-martial was scheduled for November 15th at Fort Bragg, with Captain Marcus Dane as the primary defendant. The military had chosen to prosecute him first because his case had the strongest evidence: the recorded conversation, multiple witnesses, and a clear pattern of escalating behavior. But everyone understood that this trial would set the tone for the dozen others that would follow. Defense attorney Robert Kendricks had assembled a legal team that looked more like a corporate law firm than a military defense counsel. 5 attorneys, 3 paralegals, and a jury consultant who specialized in military cases involving sexual assault allegations. Their strategy became clear during pretrial motions: attack everything except the facts. "Your Honor," Kendricks argued before military judge Colonel Sarah Montgomery, "this entire prosecution is tainted by an illegal recording obtained through entrapment. Staff Sergeant Evans deliberately created a situation designed to elicit inappropriate behavior from my client, then used that manufactured evidence to destroy his career and reputation." Captain Park's response was precise and devastating. "Your Honor, the defense is essentially arguing that planning to defend yourself against sexual assault constitutes entrapment. Staff Sergeant Evans had every reason to believe Captain Dane intended to assault her, and military regulations explicitly allow recording of conversations when misconduct is suspected." Judge Montgomery was a 30-year veteran who'd seen every possible variation of military legal maneuvering. Her reputation for fairness was matched only by her intolerance for legal theatrics, designed to obscure rather than illuminate truth. "Counsel," she said, addressing Kendricks directly, "are you seriously arguing that a soldier doesn't have the right to document evidence of crimes being committed against them?" "We're arguing that the evidence was obtained through deliberate deception designed to entrap our client into behavior he wouldn't have engaged in otherwise." "Then you're arguing that Captain Dane was somehow tricked into attempting sexual assault? That without Staff Sergeant Evans's alleged encouragement, he would never have made unwanted sexual advances toward a subordinate?" Kendricks realized his strategy was backfiring. By claiming entrapment, he was essentially admitting that Dane had committed the acts he was accused of. "Your Honor, we maintain that the recording misrepresents the nature of the interaction, and that the recording speaks for itself." "Counselor." "Motion denied. We'll proceed to jury selection." The voir dire process revealed the deep divisions within military culture about sexual assault cases. Potential jurors, all military officers, were questioned extensively about their attitudes toward women in combat roles, their understanding of consent, and their willingness to convict a fellow officer of serious crimes. Lieutenant Colonel James Bradford, an infantry officer with 3 combat deployments, was excused after admitting he believed women in the military need to understand they're in a man's world and adjust accordingly. Major Susan Chun, a logistics officer, was retained despite defense objections after stating clearly that rank should never be used to coerce sexual activity. The final jury consisted of 8 officers, 5 men and 3 women. representing various military specialties and ranging in age from 32 to 58. It was as diverse a panel as the military justice system could provide, but Bonnie knew that diversity didn't guarantee they would understand or believe her experience. The prosecution's opening statement was delivered by Captain Park with clinical precision. She laid out the timeline of events, introduced the key evidence, and presented the case as a straightforward matter of criminal behavior by someone who'd abused his authority. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Park began, "this case is about power and how it can be weaponized to victimize those who serve under your command. Captain Dane used his rank, his office, and his authority to create a situation where he believed he could sexually assault Staff Sergeant Evans without consequences." She clicked a remote, and Dane's voice filled the courtroom from the recorded conversation. "You know, Evans, I've been watching you for months. You're different from the other female soldiers on this base. I think you and I could have a very beneficial working relationship." The jury's reaction was visible. Several officers shifted uncomfortably as they heard the predatory tone in Dane's voice. The recording made the defense's claims of entrapment seem absurd. "You'll hear that recording in its entirety," Park continued. "And you'll hear exactly how Captain Dane attempted to use his authority to coerce sexual activity from a subordinate. You'll also hear testimony from other victims who suffered similar treatment at his hands, establishing a clear pattern of predatory behavior." Kendricks's opening statement was a masterclass in misdirection. Instead of defending Dane's actions, he attacked the entire investigation as a politically motivated witch hunt designed to advance certain careers at the expense of military tradition. "Distinguished officers of the jury," he began, his voice carrying the weight of false sincerity, "what you're witnessing isn't justice, it's the destruction of a decorated officer's career based on a misunderstanding that has been twisted into something sinister by ambitious prosecutors seeking headlines." He painted Dane as a victim of changing social standards, a man whose old-fashioned leadership style had been criminalized by political correctness. It was a sophisticated argument that appealed to anyone who felt that modern military culture had become too concerned with social engineering at the expense of combat effectiveness. Captain Dane represents the old guard officers who believe in direct communication, who understand that military leadership sometimes requires difficult conversations about performance and career development. What the prosecution calls sexual harassment, I call leadership in an era when saying the wrong thing can end a career. But Kendricks's strategy fell apart when the prosecution played the complete recorded conversation. Dane's voice, slurred with whiskey and thick with predatory intent, destroyed any pretense that this had been about leadership or career development. Of course, such relationships require mutual understanding, cooperation, flexibility. Dane's voice echoed through the courtroom, followed by the sound of him approaching Bonnie and her clear rejection of his advances. The impact on the jury was immediate and devastating. Several officers looked disgusted, while others appeared angry that a fellow officer had betrayed the trust placed in military leadership. The recording didn't just prove the prosecution's case, it revealed the defendant as someone who'd corrupted everything the military claimed to represent. Bonnie's testimony consumed the better part of 2 days. Captain Park walked her through every detail of her encounter with Dane, from the suspicious evening meeting to his physical assault and her defensive response. Under direct examination, Bonnie was calm, precise, and credible. "Staff Sergeant Evans," Park asked, "when Captain Dane reached for you in his office, what was going through your mind?" "Ma'am, I knew I was about to be sexually assaulted by my commanding officer. My training took over. I defended myself using the minimum force necessary to stop the attack and get to safety." "Did you at any point encourage or invite Captain Dane's behavior?" Absolutely not, ma'am. I reported for what I believed was a professional meeting about training schedules. I maintained military bearing throughout the encounter and clearly rejected his advances before being forced to defend myself. The cross-examination was brutal, but ineffective. Kendricks tried to suggest that Bonnie had planned the entire encounter, that her recording device proved premeditation, and that her quick defensive reaction indicated training rather than genuine fear. Staff Sergeant Evans, isn't it true that you came to that meeting prepared for confrontation? You brought a recording device. You'd researched the legal implications of recording a superior officer, and you'd practiced self-defense techniques. Specifically for this encounter? Bonnie's response was devastating in its simplicity. Sir, women in the military learn to prepare for assault the same way we prepare for combat. We hope it never happens, but we train for it because we know it might. Preparation doesn't mean invitation. The courtroom was silent as the implications of her words sank in. She'd articulated something that many female service members understood, but had never heard expressed so clearly, that serving in the military meant being constantly prepared for attack from their own side. Supporting testimony from Maria Gonzalez and Jessica Chun established the pattern of Dane's predatory behavior. Both women described similar scenarios: isolated meetings, inappropriate suggestions, and the clear understanding that their careers depended on compliance with sexual demands. The defense's case lasted less than a day. Character witnesses testified to Dane's military achievements and leadership qualities, but none could address the recorded evidence or explain away his documented pattern of abuse. Dane himself chose not to testify, a decision that spoke volumes about his attorney's assessment of their chances. During closing arguments, Captain Park summarized the case with prosecutorial precision. Ladies and gentlemen, you've heard Captain Dane's own words describing his predatory intentions toward Staff Sergeant Evans. You've heard testimony from multiple victims establishing a clear pattern of abuse. The evidence is overwhelming, and the law is clear. Using military authority to coerce sexual activity is a serious crime that demands accountability. Kendricks made one final attempt to muddy the waters. Members of the jury, in finding Captain Dane guilty, you're not just convicting one man, you're sending a message to every male officer in the military that normal leadership interactions with female subordinates are now criminal. You're weaponizing political correctness against military effectiveness. But Judge Montgomery's jury instructions demolish that argument. You are to consider only whether the defendant committed the specific acts he's charged with. Questions of military policy, social change, or political implications are not relevant to your deliberations. The jury deliberated for 3 hours and 17 minutes. When they returned, their verdict would send shockwaves through the military establishment and set the stage for the prosecutions that would follow. The foreman, Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Wells, stood to deliver the verdict that would begin the dismantling of a criminal network 20 years in the making. On the charge of assault with intent to commit rape, we find the defendant guilty. Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Wells's voice cut through the courtroom like a blade, each word carrying the weight of institutional reckoning. The silence that followed was absolute. Not even the scratch of a pen or rustle of paper disturbed the moment, when decades of protected predatory behavior finally met its consequences. On the charge of conduct unbecoming an officer and gentleman, we find the defendant guilty. Captain Marcus Dane's face remained stoically blank, but his hands trembled slightly as he gripped the defense table. Behind him, his father, Brigadier General Robert Dane, sat rigid in his dress uniform, the family's military legacy crumbling with each verdict. On the charge of abuse of authority, we find the defendant guilty. The final guilty verdict seemed to echo in the courtroom long after Wells had finished speaking. Judge Montgomery's gavel fell with finality, but the sound felt anticlimactic after the jury's devastating pronouncement. 20 years of protected criminal behavior had been laid bare and judged wanting by a panel of Dane's peers. The court will reconvene tomorrow at 0900 for sentencing proceedings, Montgomery announced. The defendant will remain in military custody pending final disposition. As military police approached to escort Dane away, he turned to look directly at Bonnie for the first time since the trial began. His expression wasn't hatred or anger, it was something far more unsettling. Recognition, the look of a predator who'd finally encountered prey that fought back effectively, coupled with grudging respect for an adversary who'd outmaneuvered him completely. Outside the courthouse, the media circus was in full swing. News vans lined the street, reporters thrust microphones toward anyone in uniform, and protesters on both sides of the case chanted slogans that reduced complex issues of justice and military culture to sound bites. Bonnie emerged from the building, flanked by Chief Martinez and Captain Park, their formation designed to protect her from the chaos of competing interests that had gathered around the case. The questions came like artillery fire. Staff Sergeant Evans, how does it feel to have brought down a decorated officer? Do you think this verdict will discourage other women from coming forward? What message does this send to military families about the safety of their daughters in service? Bonnie had prepared a statement with the prosecution team, but as she stood before the cameras, she realized that prepared remarks wouldn't capture what this moment really meant. She stepped forward, her voice carrying clearly over the crowd noise. This case was never about bringing down anyone. It was about holding people accountable for their actions, regardless of their rank or connections. Captain Dane used his authority to prey on women who'd volunteered to serve their country. Today, a jury of his peers said that behavior is criminal and unacceptable. She paused, looking directly into the cameras. For every woman who's been told to stay quiet, to not make waves, to accept harassment as the price of military service today, proves that the system can work when good people demand justice. The statement was brief but powerful, focusing on accountability rather than revenge, justice rather than persecution. It was the message the prosecution team had hoped to convey, but coming from Bonnie herself, it carried an authenticity that no prepared remarks could match. The sentencing hearing the next morning was standing room only. Military personnel, civilians, reporters, and victim advocates filled every available seat to witness the conclusion of a case that had captured national attention. The proceeding would determine not just Dane's punishment, but set a precedent for how seriously the military took sexual assault by its officers. The defense presented a parade of character witnesses, attempting to convince Judge Montgomery that Dane's military service outweighed his criminal behavior. Fellow officers testified to his leadership during deployments, his dedication to training young soldiers, and his family's generations of military service. Colonel Patricia Hayes, Dane's former commanding officer, provided the most compelling defense testimony. Captain Dane served under me during our deployment to Iraq in 2018. He was instrumental in training Iraqi security forces and showed exceptional courage during several combat operations. His actions directly contributed to mission success and saved American lives. It was a reminder that criminal behavior and military competence weren't mutually exclusive, that predators could be effective soldiers in some contexts while being dangerous threats in others. The complexity made sentencing more difficult, but didn't change the fundamental nature of Dane's crimes. The prosecution's sentencing presentation was delivered by Captain Park with the clinical precision that had characterized the entire trial. Your Honor, the defendant's military service, while noteworthy, cannot excuse or minimize his systematic abuse of authority. The evidence shows a pattern of predatory behavior spanning several years and multiple victims. She presented victim impact statements from the women Dane had assaulted, each one detailing the lasting damage his actions had caused to their military careers and personal lives. Jessica Chun had left the military entirely, her dream of a career in logistics destroyed by the trauma of Dane's assault. Maria Gonzalez had been forced to seek therapy and medication to deal with the anxiety that interfered with her duties. The defendant didn't just commit individual crimes. Park continued. He betrayed the trust that our military system depends On, he corrupted the chain of command, weaponized his authority, and demonstrated that rank could be used to victimize rather than protect subordinates. When Judge Montgomery asked if Dane wished to make a statement before sentencing, the courtroom fell silent. His defense team had advised against it, but Dane stood slowly, his military bearing intact despite the guilty verdicts. "Your Honor, I accept responsibility for my actions and the pain I've caused. I let down my family, my fellow officers, and the soldiers who served under my command. I have no excuse for my behavior, and I understand the consequences of my choices." The statement was carefully crafted to avoid admitting specific criminal acts while expressing general remorse. It was the kind of non-apology that defense attorneys coached clients to deliver, acknowledging harm without accepting legal responsibility. But Judge Montgomery had heard thousands of such statements over her career, and her response cut through the legal positioning to address the human cost of Dane's crimes. "Captain Dane, your crimes weren't mistakes in judgment or momentary lapses in character. They were deliberate, systematic abuse of the authority entrusted to you by the United States Army. You used your rank to terrorize subordinates who had no recourse except to endure your attacks or abandon their military careers." She paused, looking directly at the defendant. "The military depends on trust between leaders and subordinates. Trust that authority will be used to accomplish missions rather than satisfy personal desires. You violated that trust in the most fundamental way possible." The sentence, when it came, was devastating. Dismissal from service, forfeiture of all pay and allowances, reduction in rank to private, and 25 years imprisonment at Fort Leavenworth Military Prison. It was effectively a life sentence. For a 34-year-old man, ensuring he would spend his prime years behind bars and emerge as a broken, elderly convict with no military benefits or civilian job prospects. The Dane family's reaction was immediate and bitter. Brigadier General Robert Dane stormed from the courtroom without speaking to reporters, but his wife, Patricia Dane, stopped at the microphones to deliver a statement that revealed the depth of institutional resistance to the verdict. "This sentencing is a travesty that sacrifices a decorated combat veteran to political correctness. My son served his country with honor in multiple deployments, and he's being destroyed by an investigation that targets male officers for behavior that was acceptable for generations. This isn't justice, it's persecution." The statement encapsulated the defense argument that had failed in court but would continue to resonate in certain military circles, that prosecuting sexual assault represented an attack on traditional military culture rather than enforcement of existing laws. But for the 43 confirmed victims of the larger conspiracy, Dane's sentencing represented something more significant than legal precedent. It proved that the system could be forced to protect them rather than their attackers, that evidence and determination could overcome rank and connections. Bonnie watched the proceedings from the gallery, feeling a mixture of satisfaction and exhaustion. Justice had been served in this case, but 11 other defendants awaited trial, and each prosecution would bring new challenges and new attempts to undermine the investigation. Chief Martinez approached her as the courtroom emptied. "How are you holding up?" "I'm ready for the next one," Bonnie replied, her voice steady with determination. Dane was just the beginning. The real test comes when we prosecute the senior officers who protected and enabled him. As they left the courthouse, Bonnie reflected on how much had changed since that evening in Dane's office when she'd made the split-second decision to fight back. What had started as individual self-defense had become institutional reform, proving that sometimes one person's courage could force an entire system to confront its failures. The war against military sexual assault was far from over, but for the first time in decades, the predators were on the defensive and their victims had reason to hope for justice. The remaining trials would determine whether Dane's conviction was an anomaly or the beginning of a fundamental transformation in how the military protected its most vulnerable members. But as Bonnie prepared for the battles ahead, she knew that, regardless of the outcomes, she'd already achieved something invaluable. She'd proven that fighting back was possible, that victims didn't have to accept abuse as the price of service, and that sometimes justice required someone willing to throw the first punch. 18 months after Captain Dane's conviction, Staff Sergeant Bonnie Evans stood before a joint session of Congress in the Hart Senate Office Building. The room was packed with lawmakers, military officials, victim advocates, and reporters who had followed the prosecution of what had become known as the Fort Davidson Network, the largest military sexual assault conspiracy in modern American history. The final statistics were staggering. 11 additional officers convicted, 43 victims who had received justice, and systematic reforms implemented across all branches of the military. But the numbers only told part of the story. The real transformation was cultural, a fundamental shift in how the military viewed and responded to sexual assault within its ranks. Bonnie adjusted the microphone before beginning her testimony to the Senate Armed Services Committee. She wore her dress uniform with the ribbons and decorations she'd earned through 6 years of exemplary service. But her presence here represented something far more significant than individual achievement. Senators, 18 months ago, I was just another soldier doing my job and trying to serve my country with honor. I never intended to become the face of military reform or to testify before Congress about institutional failures. I became those things because Captain Marcus Dane forced me to choose between my safety and my silence. She paused, looking directly at the senators who would determine funding and oversight for military justice programs. I chose my safety, and in doing so, I discovered that my experience wasn't isolated. It was part of a systematic campaign to drive women out of military service through intimidation, assault, and institutional cover-ups. The hearing was the culmination of investigations that had exposed corruption reaching to the highest levels of military command. 3 general officers had been forced into retirement after evidence emerged that they'd actively suppressed assault investigations to protect their own careers. The private investigation firm that had targeted victims was under federal indictment for conspiracy and fraud. Most significantly, Congress had passed the Military Justice Improvement Act, removing sexual assault cases from the chain of command and placing them under independent prosecutor oversight. Senator Patricia Hawthorne, who had initially questioned the investigation's impact on military readiness, now served as one of its strongest supporters. The evidence had been too overwhelming and too well documented for political considerations to override. Staff Sergeant Evans, Senator Hawthorne said, your courage in fighting back and refusing to be silenced has led to the most comprehensive reform of military justice in decades. But some critics argue that these prosecutions have created a climate of fear among male officers who worry that normal interactions with female subordinates might be misinterpreted. How do you respond to those concerns? Bonnie had anticipated the question and prepared an answer that cut to the heart of the cultural resistance they'd encountered. Senator, with respect, normal military interactions don't involve cornering subordinates in isolated locations, making sexually explicit suggestions, or using rank to coerce compliance with sexual demands. The officers who were prosecuted weren't engaging in normal leadership, they were committing crimes. She leaned forward slightly, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd lived through the experience she was describing. Any male officer who's concerned about being falsely accused should ask himself whether he's ever used his authority to make a subordinate uncomfortable, whether he's ever made sexually suggestive comments, or whether he's ever retaliated against someone who rejected his advances. If the answer is no, then he has nothing to fear from these reforms. The response drew murmurs of approval from the gallery, where dozens of female veterans sat watching the proceedings. Many were survivors who had found the courage to come forward. After seeing the Fort Davidson, Network prosecutions succeed. The hearing's most powerful moment came when Senator Michael Rodriguez asked Bonnie to address the personal cost of her decision to fight back. Staff Sergeant, you've endured 18 months of legal proceedings, media scrutiny, and personal attacks. You've been threatened, harassed, and subjected to character assassination attempts. Knowing what you know now about the price you'd pay, would you make the same choice again? Bonnie's answer came without hesitation. Senator, every single day. Because the alternative was allowing predators to continue operating with impunity, while more women suffered in silence. The personal cost to me is insignificant compared to the cost to our military's integrity and effectiveness when leaders abuse their authority to victimize subordinates. She gestured toward the gallery where Maria Gonzalez, Jessica Chen, and dozens of other survivors sat watching. These women deserved justice, and the women who will serve after us deserve protection. If 18 months of difficulty was the price for ensuring that, it was a bargain. Asterisk, the reforms that emerged from the scandal were comprehensive and lasting. The Military Sexual Assault Prevention and Response Office was restructured with independent authority and increased funding. Victim advocates were embedded at every installation with direct reporting lines outside the local chain of command. Most importantly, a new generation of military leaders was being trained with zero tolerance for the institutional silence that had protected predators for decades. Colonel James Richardson, who had overseen the initial investigation at Fort Davidson, was promoted to brigadier general and placed in charge of implementing the new protocols across the Army. His first official act was to establish a memorial at Fort Davidson honoring the courage of the women who had come forward. With Bonnie's name prominently featured as the catalyst for institutional change, but perhaps the most significant transformation was in the stories that young female soldiers told about their military experience. Where previous generations had accepted harassment as an inevitable part of service, new recruits were being trained to recognize, report, and resist inappropriate behavior from the moment they entered military service. Private Sarah Martinez, a supply specialist at Fort Benning, exemplified the cultural shift. When a staff sergeant made inappropriate comments about her appearance during a training exercise, SAC immediately reported the incident through the new independent reporting system. The staff sergeant was investigated, disciplined, and required to undergo extensive retraining, all within a week of the initial report. I knew from day one that I didn't have to accept that kind of treatment, Martinez explained to a reporter. Covering the anniversary of the Fort Davidson prosecutions, Staff Sergeant Evans and the other women who came forward made it clear that we have the right to serve without being harassed or assaulted. Their courage gave the rest of us permission to demand better. The ripple effects extended beyond the military. Corporate America began adopting similar independent oversight systems for sexual harassment complaints. Universities restructured their disciplinary processes to remove conflicts of interest that had protected faculty predators. The principle that institutional authority couldn't be used to shield criminal behavior became a cornerstone of reform movements across multiple sectors. As the congressional hearing concluded, Bonnie reflected on the journey that had begun with a single moment of resistance in Captain Dane's office. She joined the military to serve something larger than herself, never imagining that service would require taking on the institution itself. But in fighting for justice, she discovered that true patriotism sometimes meant forcing your country to live up to its highest ideals rather than accepting its failures. The final question came from Senator Elizabeth Warren, who had championed military reform legislation throughout her career. Staff Sergeant Evans, what message do you have for young women considering military service? Has this experience changed your view of whether the military is a safe place for women to serve? Bonnie's response captured both the progress that had been made and the vigilance that would always be required. Senator, the military is safer for women today than it was 18 months ago, but only because good people were willing to fight for change. My message to young women is this: you have the right to serve your country without being victimized by those who are supposed to lead you. You have the support of laws, systems, and people who will stand with you if predators target you. And, most importantly, you have the power to fight back. She stood as the hearing concluded, her military bearing intact but transformed by the experience of forcing institutional change through individual courage. Around her, the senators, advocates, and survivors who had fought alongside her, prepared to continue the work of ensuring that her sacrifice would have lasting meaning. The war against military sexual assault wasn't over. It would require constant vigilance and continued courage from future generations of service members. But the Fort Davidson network prosecutions had proven something invaluable: that institutional corruption could be defeated by individuals willing to risk everything for justice. As Bonnie left the Capitol building, she carried with her the knowledge that her decision to fight back in that office had rippled outward in ways she'd never anticipated. One moment of resistance had become a movement for reform, proving that sometimes the most important battles weren't fought on foreign soil, but within the institutions that claimed to protect the very values they were betraying. The young woman who had entered Captain Dane's office as a potential victim had emerged as a catalyst for generational change, ensuring that future soldiers would inherit a military worthy of their service and sacrifice. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.